go ahead and get started just so we're sticking to the schedule. I don't want to, it's my first conference teaching for a very long time. I don't want Ian getting mad at me. And not. It's like he goes over all the time. He starts late. Let's pray. God, thank you for an awesome day so far. God, thank you for what you're doing in our hearts, God, for the ideas and the pieces of the things that we've been able to glean from all the speakers. God, we thank you for the chance to get to come and just talk about technology in general and all the pieces surrounding it. God, I pray that you would give me focus. God, give me clarity. And God, if there's anything that's not of you, that you would put it through one ear and out the other. God, we thank you for letting us be a part of what you're doing in this conference and in the church with a big C. God, bless this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, first off, thank you guys for being here. I'm still kind of weirded out that I'm on the other end of the technology, but I know I'm hoping to kind of give some insights on some things that I've learned. I grew up, if you were with me yesterday, I grew up in a church of like 50 people in a town of 700. First mixer I was on was a little 12-channel Soundcraft. Wasn't nothing fancy about it. There was one EAW box, smaller than that one, that was trying to throw the length of this room plus. And so that's what I grew up in. And I realized kind of in my senior year of high school that I grew up in a musical family, but I knew I did not have the talent to go make a living off of that. And so I also figured out halfway through high school that I kind of liked technology. I got into car audio and taking things apart and started reading some of the manuals. Is like, oh, this is kind of fun. Took my mom's boombox apart like partway through high school. My dream when I was coming through high school was I was going to be Third Day's studio engineer. I was going to record all of Third Day's albums, and that was going to be my thing because they were the stuff at the time. I mean, they're still doing okay. But I made it about one semester into a technical school out in the middle of nowhere, West Texas, that probably one of the best programs in the nation. I would pit them against Full Sail any day of the year. Because they had this great marriage of the tech guys and the musicians all under one roof. And so you had guys that were trying to record projects and guys that were trying to record projects, and they needed each other. So you learned how to work with a team right off the bat. But anyway, it took me about half a semester to realize I hated listening to the same song for 8 hours straight to get the thing dialed in right, and made friends with, they had 2 live audio classes just so you could learn how to put a PA together and the parts of a sound system and a little bit of mixed technique in a room situation. And the guy that taught that, he was one of the professors, but he also side hustled at a couple of churches as the tech guy and had his own little PA. And he, for some reason, decided that we got along really well, and he decided to pour into me. And I ended up on tour with him and a company for a few years, kind of progressed from there. Decided I didn't want to do touring one night, doing a bar thing on New Year's Eve, and was like, I don't want to be here. And so ended up back in church world after some different ministry stints. But I like to say it all started with the 16-channel little analog desk, which is where most of us has ever started. But I learned some things in every situation. So I titled this What I Did because I've been in the church that had a piano, a couple vocals, the pastor, maybe a couple of worship leaders here and there. The stuff that we ran into as a church that small, I like to say the 24 input or less church. And then my first full-time paying gig at a church was a full band, drums, bass, guitar, the full band situation. And now I'm at a church that is, by all accounts, the big mega church and all the joys and concerns that come with it. I'm not unpacking this in a like, oh, this is for the 500 person or less church or the 500 to 1,000 person church. No, I'm kind of looking at your input list, kind of the stuff that I've seen make the biggest difference, because I'm a sound guy first and foremost. I've learned how to do the video and the lighting and everything else, because it kind of came with the territory. But sound is my happy place. You'll find me mixing at every church I've been at, probably 9 out of 10 weekends. Not because I have to, but because I love to. Like, that's my worship experience. I take my time off during the week. That's my pace. Please don't take that as what you should do. I take my time off during the week because that's when I have to sit in meetings and the projects and the planning center, putting all together things. And I get to take vacation from those things and go hang out with my family. But I want to unpack, if you're in a big church, I'm going to give you some of the small church stuff so that if those small churches are coming to you guys for input, you kind of have some good baselines to give those guys. Does that make sense? And then same thing with kind of the middle-sized churches. So with that I talked about the Ricky Yanis at my church yesterday. The one good old boy that's doing sound and video and lights, and he does this, he's the weekend warrior. It's kind of what we call him. But what most of these guys don't have is the basics. When I do sound trainings, we go through the 3 basics. I talked a little bit about this yesterday. So the first one is signal flow. So how does it get from a microphone to the soundboard, through the processing, whether that is, we usually call it like system processing, or if it's like compressors and gates and EQs and stuff that are like outboard and how that all gets there. But then the system processing, so your crossovers and limiters, the protection for your system from blowing to pieces, all the way to the speakers. So teaching them how that all goes through there so that if something goes a little awry, they can at least go through and do some minor troubleshooting. The second piece is frequency recognition. This is a hard one because it's ear training and it doesn't come necessarily naturally to everyone, but it is a skill that you can teach. There's an app, it's called Quiz Tones. That's on both Apple and Android platform that I hand off to a lot of my students when I get them. And what it'll do is it'll take it through, okay, what does 5,000 hertz sound like as a tone? And being able to recognize it for feedback, we'll call it whack-a-mole. Or it'll play music and instruments, and it'll tell you okay, in this one we're boosting 1,000 hertz in an acoustic guitar, or it's telling you something's been boosted in this guitar 3 dB. What is it? And it'll give you a 4. Yeah, it's great ear training. There's this thing that I had to do in college that was mind-numbing version of that. It's called Golden Ears. I don't know if it still exists because I'm not going to tell you how long ago I went to college. 23 years ago. So frequency recognition. And the third one is mix technique, is taking both of those things and putting it together. How do I adjust certain frequencies in a vocal and in a guitar and the bass and the drums to make it all meld together? And I don't care if you're the drummer, but you can't have the snare drum this loud and the lead vocal this loud, especially in worship music. The it takes you can develop an ear, but I also tell people sometimes, so if you're the one that's trying to like put together your volunteer team, sometimes it's easier to take a musician and teach them the techie than it is to take a techie and teach them the musicianship. Because I've dealt with both, and sometimes taking the guy that I'm not knocking network engineers, but I've had several of those guys. I've had guys that's like, oh yeah, I work on TVs, or I work on electronics, or I do this thing. I'm like, great. You want to fix all my gear for me? They're like, no, I want to mix. I'm like, okay, let's try it. And they will get the principles. And some of those guys, you can teach them a lot of those fundamentals, and it may be a little more controlled than you want, but they'll put it into like, okay, I can replicate what you're telling me to do every time, anytime. So then they can work too. But it definitely is easier to take the musicians like, oh, I hear that difference in the tones and everything else kind of naturally, and teach them like, okay, this is how you tweak that. Okay, go ahead. The other piece that we ran into, I was telling you about that single EAW that was trying to fling across a really long room. We tend to not put system processing in. So if you're dealing with, I go into a lot of small churches, they're like, we blew the high frequency driver in the thing. And then I go back in the closet and there's no limiters, no protection. There's a crossover there maybe, but you also are using it as the youth room. And having been a youth at one time, like I went and I turned the bass up because man, I want that thing like pumping and loud. And you know what we didn't have in that room? A subwoofer to handle the boom. So that was kind of the other piece in that. Is like several churches that size, I've told them like, hey, a few $100, you can get into some sort of like processing that has a limiter on it. So if somebody puts feedback through your system, it's not going to blow your high frequency driver. Or little Billy comes in there and turns the 80 hertz up 15 dB, you're not going to blow the low frequency driver and make sparks. I've put this rule of thumb out there on systems. For every 100 seats, one single 18-inch driver. So if you're doing subs, I was in a church that it was about 600 people, and we had 4 18s, and that was just enough. I'm currently in a venue that seats 1,800, and I've got 16 of them, and it's enough. But until a rapper shows up, and then I'm watching my limiters just sit there and like, nope, I will not go any louder. So it's a very general rule. Please don't tell your integrators I said that, but it's a good like judge of what they're trying to do too. So yeah, 118 per 100 people is a good one, because what that's going to do is going to take a lot of the low frequency stuff out of that speaker and make your system more efficient, keep it from blowing stuff up. Everything I'm sharing here is just to try to like help you guys save some money or put it in the right places. This is very general term stuff. If you want to go deeper on any of this, we'll unpack it a little bit. If you're that kind of small a church, please stop spending so much money on wireless microphones. I don't know how many I've walked into that they've got 5 of them in the back, and all of them are either 20 years old and are on frequencies that you're not supposed to be using, or they were made by like some manufacturer that even China's never heard of. I like to say, especially with churches that size, go simple, but don't go cheap. That works across the spectrum, but it's kind of been my mantra with install stuff. Church that size, I'd rather see you spend a decent amount of money on the pastor's wireless mic, because dude's going to talk with his hands and carry his Bible, and yeah, they may want to use a handheld mic, great, but that's the single most important microphone it's going to be used the most during your service. And Shure and Sennheiser, AKG, Audio-Technica, like the name brands are name brands because they're trusted. I like to say they're road tested. I try not to buy anything that I haven't seen somebody like take on tour and beat the snot out of, and it made it back. So yeah, because unless your worship leader is like on wireless in-ears at that size and roaming around the place, stick dude on a wired 58 on a stand and just make him be there. It's okay. The other piece on some of that this is coming from my experience at my little church was don't skimp out on the infrastructure pieces. Cabling from Amazon versus at least decently put together. I'm a big fan of Neutrik connectors because they're way easier to clip the end off. It's probably broken somewhere in that last like few feet of the cable, but they're the easiest to repair. There's so many videos out there that'll teach you how to solder. Just put one in front of whoever your guy is, or if you're the guy, go on YouTube and learn how to solder. It'll go a long way. But yeah, your snake from the back of the room to the front of the room, the cheapest is not necessarily what you need to go for. Get something with really good shielding. A good braided shielding goes a long way in your cabling and a lot of pieces. The infrastructure pieces, don't skimp on that because nothing sucks worse than like the video cable from that booth up to this projector just decides, nope, I'm done. It's only been 2 years. Well, that's as long as you're going to get out of a $150 cable. Kind of moving into I like to call them kind of the middle-sized churches, even though it kind of seems like a weird term. It's basically like input list, like I said. You've moved from the acoustic band, mostly kind of the piano, maybe an acoustic guitar. Now you've got drums. Changes everything. Because now you've gone from, please don't try to put drums through a PA that size, unless you've got subs on the floor in several different places and you're only trying to fill a room this size. The biggest pieces, so I was technical director at Calvary Worship Center down in Colorado Springs. That was kind of my first sort of medium-sized church. And at that size, I really start pushing churches like at least a part-time, if not a full-time tech director or sound guy at least. And this is kind of my view on who do I hire first. Well, we want to do video well. Should we hire a video guy? Well, like I was talking about a little bit yesterday, in the video stuff, you can kind of set some of those things and then just have somebody sort of a playlist of stuff. You can script out a lot of things for your video director so that you simplify it for your volunteers. Lighting, kind of the same thing. The only thing you can't put a playlist together for is the dynamics of a band, especially once you get drums in the mix. It's a whole new world. And so trying to create consistency is really hard to create consistency if you don't have a consistent behind in that seat, behind the board. Getting to where you're developing them and they're developing with the band and you're all making decisions together on this is what we're going to try to make this thing do. The first thing I got when I got to Calvary was a decibel meter, which was a totally different world for me. The unpacking the volume wars, as I like to call them, cannot be done by your sound guy. Please don't make him make that decision. You have to have buy-in from everyone, from the senior pastor to the parking lot guy, because the parking lot guy is going to be the one that somebody's going to mention on the way out. Why was it so loud? And the parking lot guy needs to be able to say, hey, we understand that the volume that verbiage is a huge thing when you're talking through this one especially. We, as a church, have decided we want it this loud because of we want it to be full, we want it to be however you want to word that. I have a write out that I put together when I got to Mission Hills that I walked through with my senior pastor, my executive pastor, my worship leader, and our communications director. And I put it in front of them. I was like, pick this to pieces and tell me if this floats. And so now we have it in this nice little package. And if somebody walks up, they're like, hey, can I see the thing? And they're able to hand it to someone. So it explains kind of why we run it at the volume we do. How do we measure that? In most of your decibel meters, can you put the meter slide up? Aha! You will see meters say dBA or dBc most of the time. It'll have some other ones in there as far as like Z, I think, is out there, and QXWY, I don't know. A and C are the two biggest ones that I see most people measuring from. dBA is what OSHA, like the government standard for all the things, is going to measure from. We measure from that as a reference because they set standards on at what level can I run this for how much time before I start causing hearing damage. You go listen to, can you put the measurement one up there? Or the, that one. So let's say you're running at 94 dBA for an hour straight. That means an hour constant. Is music constant? Nope. So it's a totally different ballgame for us. But which 94 dBA is what my church, that is our peak. That's not our average. If you looked at our 15-minute average, it's probably closer to 85, which is, 85, that's a long time. And that would be constant, that they would have to have it at that to hurt somebody. So I love it when Apple Watch came out with a stupid little thing on their little meter that goes off and tells everybody, it's too loud, it's going to hurt your hearing. If I ran it at that constantly for the next 3 hours, yes, we would. What we cap at, so when I'm watching my meters, I will see it maybe get up to 94. But if you watch my, we'll get to that in a minute. So how do we keep it at a level that everybody is happy with? Again, it's back to that consistency thing. And what's the most dynamic thing on that stage? So I'm going to throw a dirty word out there. Drum cages. Please don't hit me. For the musicians and the drummers especially, please don't throw things at me. Every church I've been at has made that move, and it has been so drastic of a improvement in the consistency of sound that even the finance guy, who is not a musician, not a sound guy, is like, man, it just sounds punchier. Why? Because science. So if I'm standing right here and I clap, where did you hear that clap come from? Off this wall, off this wall, off the floor, off this wall, off the ceiling, off the LED wall that's now on back of the stage, and probably off that back wall and come at you. So science says, let's get rid of a few of those reverberations, or what happens is the snap of that snare is hitting you directly. It's hitting you at however much time that took. So now, rather than having this nice little defined snare snap, you've got you've got multiple versions of that snap hitting you within milliseconds of each other, which smears the drums, makes it not feel like there's any definition to it. Too much science? Y'all good with me? Y'all tracking with me? Cool, my people. Same thing with a kick drum, same thing with toms, same thing with your guitar amplifier that you want to point a big old Vox or Mesa Boogie straight into the front 15 rows. Same thing with the big 410 cab of bass. Having those waves versus your subs that are 15 feet in front of them, all kind of bouncing around, and now it's coming from different places. What we're trying to do, I'm not a control freak, I promise, as a sound guy. I just want to try to create the consistency, because if the only snare, the only instruments I'm having to deal with are coming through those things, now I'm only dealing with that one source rather than all the reflections or as many reflections. Well, I'm not going to talk about acoustics and how we're going to mess with those, but if you can get it to where you're just dealing with what's coming through the PA, we've cut down on the variables way. Consistency. So now that I'm going to say this one too. At that size, it's time to start having the conversation about, can we please get everybody off wedges and onto in-ear monitors? When I got to Calvary, everybody but the vocalist was on IEMs, and they were good. The vocalists, they all still wanted to be on wedges, and we're like, well, I think it's time we put everybody on them. And the first thing, and I had some great vocalists, don't get me wrong, they were phenomenal vocalists, but every one of them came up to me after the first couple weeks, were like, man, I hate that I can hear myself so well. Because this thing is kind of smearing it. Like, if you've ever stuck your head in in-ears versus your PA, you're like, oh my gosh, you sound like that? Or this sounds really mean, but like hearing them this close to the thing, sorry, microphone, hearing them this close to the thing versus like it after it gets through everything else and smeared, way different. It will make them a better vocalist, but it's going to take some conversations and building that trust that we talked about yesterday with your band, having the conversations. Why? Don't science them to death, but it's been funny. I talked to a couple of drummers. We just, a year ago, put a glass shield around our drums at Mission Hills, and that room was built for orchestral. It was built to be reflective. So we had a hardwood floor, an LED wall, and these big like wing walls that were meant to like focus everything in. So I had the snare drum coming at me 6 different ways. And, but I started explaining some of that science to the drummers, and they're like, oh, that totally makes sense. And I had a vocalist this last weekend. She's been in theater all her life. So she's trying to make that transition from wedges or just the open air, whatever's there, where it's smeared and she didn't have to worry about, she hears herself a little bit, but not this close. So, but it will make them better vocalists. They'll make them better guitar players too, because now they're right there in front of their amplifier. Enough said. For the part-time, or hopefully if you can swing it, full-time sound person, at this point, I'm not going to assume, but you're probably at the point that you're moving towards a digital console, and nearly every one of those in some form or fashion will do what we call virtual sound checks. What is that, for if you don't know? So multi-track recording all of your instruments and then being able to play all those back at the same time through your board, because the musicians get to practice all week, and we get 4 times through the song before we do a service at best, and then we're expected to make it sound like the album. So One thing I implemented at Calvary was started doing virtual sound check. I started doing presets for most of my musicians, all of my vocalists. We were using a kind of different system. I'll get into plugins later, but we were using Waves plugins that church. But I had a very limited amount of them that I could use. But being able to go back through and set presets for a lot of that stuff, again, consistency. So you've got a consistent person at a consistent volume that everybody's on board with, using gear so that you can run it back and hopefully dial in a consistent tone for them. Now, moving into the big boy churches, I call it you're probably past 48 channels, and most of the time that's because you've started getting into tracks and just a lot of playback stuff, and it's coming from different directions. So these are things that we at Mission Hills are dealing with right now. These are the tensions we're trying to manage from yesterday. Stop trying to be somebody else. This is something that me and my broadcast engineer have been working through, the two of us. We will be sitting there trying to make this volunteer band sound like Elevation themselves. And why will my drummer not hit the snare the way that the Bethel guy plays it? Stop it. Take what you have and just make it musical. Just mix it. Stop trying to bend them into submission and just make it is what it is. There's sometimes we were talking through, especially acoustic guitar, he kept trying to make it sound like this Martin that he loved forever. I love Martin guitars, by the way. But the guy was playing something else. I'm like, you're never going to make it sound like that guitar. You're beating your head on the wall trying to make it sound like something else. Just be you. But we trying to decide too some of those big picture things. Something that made the biggest difference for us, go back to consistency. So instead of buying, we had an amplifier go out, guitar amp. We'd done the mic thing. We'd put it off stage, so it wasn't stage volume. And I know everybody's probably already doing this, but we moved into like Kempers and Helix. Why? Because the consistency of it. Because guys would show up and I'd have 30 seconds to get the microphone in the absolute sweet spot of this amplifier that I haven't seen for 3 months since he was scheduled last time, and I don't remember where it was, and the tape has come off. Or I went through and bought profiles of the amps that my guys were showing up with. I'm like, listen, can you just plug into this thing? And I had a good friend of mine who owns a studio. He's probably one of the best guitar players I've ever worked with. Absolute gear snob. Walked in and played through the profile I'd put together for his amp. And he's like, dude, that's my amp. Maybe a little, that's what I wanted my amp to sound like. I was like, yes. And from then on, like there's a couple other guitar players that weren't totally sold on moving to the Kempers. And I'm like, hey, listen, we got him to buy in on it. So I worked with them, and it's like, well, what do you want it to sound like? Because we can dial it in and tweak it and find another version, but it's consistent. It's the best version of that amp through the best microphone in the perfect place through the best preamps and board, recorded to whatever, mastered and kicked out for your listening pleasure. We've also been we were talking about that. Getting your band on at least a click for that consistency of timing and just getting everybody on the same page. Whether you get into tracks and guides and everything else, it's a good investment to start to fill in your mixes. I've never mixed with tracks until I went to Mission Hills, and now I kind of love it because we split ours out to like 16 channels worth shows up to my board. Thus, my channel count is a little ridiculous right now. But there's 3 electric channels and some pads channels and some synth channels and some perk channels and a vocal channel. Okay, I've got my band, but man, like being able to underbed some of that stuff with the pads or kind of fill in a part on the electric just to create a better experience and better sound from everybody has been really fun. I mean, just as an engineer, like it's a lot of fun. And the band is totally bought into it. They're like, okay, like I tell them, I'm like, I want you to learn the hook. I'll fill in with that little bit of rhythm, not so much so that everybody goes, wait a second, there's not another guitar up there. Don't break out like the big, like soaring vocal part during the middle of the thing. It's like, no, we all know Brooke Fraser's not up there singing that harmony line right now. Plugins won't fix your mix, so get back to the basics. If you're at the big church and you've gotten into Waves or whatever plugins, stop sitting back there at the board, tweaking and tweaking and tweaking and going in circles. Just walk up to the stage and talk with your vocalist who keeps doing this every time they go to the big note. I've had the conversation, I feel like, for every week of my life for the last 20 years. Just stick it on your chin. I kind of say it kind of a little bit jokingly. I'm like, hey, you know where all the sound's coming from? That little dangly thing in the back of your throat. So let's get the microphone as close as we can to it. But I've told him, like, hey, do me a favor. Talk like this and see what you sound like, and then talk like this and just see how much fuller and richer your voice is. Verbiage goes a long way. Fuller and richer versus like, you sound thin and like distant. It's like, show them, hey, you can sound, I know you want to sound fuller and richer. Let's get closer to the source. Because we've got these really awesome compressors and EQs and dynamic EQs, multiband compressor, all the things. Got all the toys in the world anymore. We can keep up with the dynamics of the vocals. I was chasing down a problem with my kick drum about 2 months ago, one of my toms, and I had 5 plugins on the thing trying to like get it to sound right. Finally, one day I walked up and moved the microphone that far, turned all the plugins off. I'm like, that's what I've been trying to get to. So just take the time, go back to the fundamentals, go back to the stage, work with your band. This is very much a mixing thing that a little bit of science and a little bit of, I don't know, I'm not going to say personal preference, but something that I've noticed. Can you put that curve up there? So has anybody ever heard of the Fletcher-Munson curve or the equal loudness curve? Cool. All right. So we were talking about, actually go back to the measurement one. Yeah. So dBA, you notice like understanding of frequencies. Anybody who understands frequencies in here? Kind of, okay, really fast science lesson. The human ear hears from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. The low stuff down below 100. The like sub-bass stuff is below 50. The like breathy bits in a vocal and like the string noise up above like 8K. And then like your vocal range, the really like harsh stuff that everybody gets annoyed with is probably between like 2,000 and 5,000 hertz. That's the edgy, like, yeah, like when she soars that vocal and it just like pierces the back of your skull. The guitar part screams like way up on the high parts and it hurts. All right, now let's go back to so 1,000 hertz, 10,000 hertz, 100 hertz. This is basically if you were putting out a test tone at like completely flat, your ear hears basically upside down of this. Does that make sense? So if I had 1,000 hertz, let's just say I'm running my vocal hits right around 94 dB. So how loud is my bass stuff down below 100 hertz going to be to kind of feel like it's at the same level? That's almost 120. It's because the human ear doesn't hear flat. We hear this stuff more. We hear this stuff more. So we basically hear at those levels inverted of this, basically. So if I'm going to mix, if you watched, anybody ever worked with Smart or like a real-time analyzer kind of thing? So you can see how loud all the frequencies are. You've probably seen it on TV where it's like all the little dancing little fingers of things on the thing. If you watch mine, I'm trying to get roughly somewhere around this curve. So most of the time in some of my mix, like I'm ducking out a little bit in like 2.5 to like 5,000 hertz or so. And some of this mid-rangey stuff that is just gonna it's gonna be the stuff that echoes all over the room and gets muddy anyway. But then like the sub-bass stuff, the kick drum, some of those like, I wanna feel it kind of things. If you watch my C weighting when I'm mixing, it's probably at like, I'll hit 112 sometimes on like a big part of a song, but that 94 dBA, like these are the frequencies kind of in here. When it gets loud at that concert and then you wake up the next morning and it hurts, go back to that measurement one. Yep, that one. That's why they measure through here, because that's the stuff that's going to cause the most hearing damage. The big bass hit for a moment isn't necessarily going to do as much, but it helps make the mix feel fuller. And I'm going to totally steal this line from Ken Van Druten. Like, everybody wants the album with impact when they're hearing the worship mixes. You can go back to the curve. So, yeah, you can look this up. There's a couple of little variations that I've seen kind of in the lower end, but as a sort of rule, if you're mixing a big band through a big PA, you're kind of getting to that level in the big church world, just kind of think about it and try it. If it doesn't work for you, forget me. But we've noticed we've started kind of mixing into that a little bit, and we're getting that same impact without people going like, it's just so loud. I've gone to some big concerts, and I've watched the guys metering, and it's just basically this flat across, and it feels so harsh and mid-rangey and borderline hurts because they're running at 100, 105 dBA, and that's just loud, even for me, and I like it loud. So anyway, that's just very much a scientific piece that I've been handed off to mix engineers that I rub shoulders with and be like, hey, this is something we've been doing. Think it over. See how that works for you. Report back to me, because I don't want to keep talking about stuff if it doesn't work. Okay, a couple of other practical things, and I want to leave time for Q&A. Okay. I'm going to skip that part. One big thing. Stop waiting 15 years to redo all of your stuff at once. Churches have a really bad MO of they wait 10, 12, 20 years, and then they spend 5 times their annual budget trying to redo the video, the lighting, all the systems at once. I'm really blessed that my executive team went with me on this. Last year, we created a 5 to 7 year plan to replace every one of the, I call them showstopper pieces. That's your soundboard, speaker system, cameras, video switcher, projectors, lighting board, and lights. 7 things in 7 years. So once a year, I'm just going to use dollars and cents rather than tens and hundreds and millions of dollars, whatever. I hope you have $1 million budget. That'd be great. Buy me a couple of things. let's say every 10 years you spend $1. So how about once a year we spend 15 cents, 20 cents, 25 cents, upgrade the pieces. So I put in front of them, this year we're redoing our front of house console. Next year we're redoing our projectors that are over 8 years old. So waiting until the stuff fails, and then you're scramble moding and having to figure out where are we going to find, a decent, so let's just, okay, an X32 that everyone has, still a $2,500 investment without stage boxes and any of the bolt-ons. So let's say $5,000 at least. In a church that like your AV budget as a whole is maybe 6, maybe you're doing well and you got 20. That's still a lot of money to try to find a place for. That does not come out of your budget. So I told them, I was like, these are what we called capital purchases. Your budget is replacing cables and pieces and upgrading the DIs and maybe like a new lens for our Blackmagic camera. Yeah, that makes sense? So something to kind of talk through with your pastor and your worship pastor, and learn to speak the language of whoever your finance person is, whether they're called a CFO all the way down to the bookkeeping lady. Learn how she does business. Learn to speak her language. Learn to speak their language. I've got a really cool lady that does all of our accounting stuff, and I go to her at least once a week and I go, how we doing? I know our budget really well. That's part of my job, is the budget for our department. But I go talk to her and be like, am I putting this in the right places when I'm spending money on certain things? How can I make her life easier when it comes to the audits once a year? So I'm labeling things correctly. Training. So we were talking about the small church guys. Go make friends with the big church guys. If you're a medium-sized church guy, I was luckily, my time at Calvary Worship Center, I had a season where we weren't doing a ton of projects. Like, there was things that we could be doing, but we were kind of holding off on. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go hang out with the New Life guys. Go hang out with the guys at Mountain View and all these other like our-sized churches. Building relationships. One, so I have guys to bounce stuff off of, learn stuff from, go in and listen to their PA. The best demos you can do are not having the company come in and show you off their stuff. Go to somebody else's church and see their work. See how they did their cabling. See what the PA sounds like and how they left it with the end user. Big church guys, don't let your integrator get away with a mediocre PA install. You've been in that room long enough. You've got your chops well enough that you know what you're hearing. Trust your ear. I walked through this with a national organization, and I let them leave the building and knowing I don't think that's in the right spot, but I'm the new guy. Who am I to tell them what to do? Lo and behold, it was a cluster trying to get them to come back in and fix it. And then I was like, yeah, it sounds okay, but I just feel like something's off. Finally, we got them to come back in and relook at the PA. There was 1 or 2 boxes that were completely like out of sync with the rest of it. And it was throwing all of it off to the point that it was like, I don't like mixing in here right now. It's not fun. And basically, I finally got up the gumption. I was like, listen, either you come in and fix it, or I'm going to go hire another company to come in and fix it, and I'm going to need the passwords to our PA. And they showed up with the guy that builds, I won't say the name of the international act that they also service. He came in, sings. It's not perfect, but it's way better. I talked about training material yesterday with MXU, MXU.rocks. Those guys are great for the beginning. It's like $20 for the like baseline thing. We were talking about this on break. Like, if you just need the fundamentals, like don't know some of the science of sound and don't know like what a compressor is and EQ and the frequency, like start there. But those guys are a great resource. They're one of the few resources that I tell people about because there's a lot of other ones that they do some great stuff, but I don't feel like it's scalable all the way. Okay, wanted to leave way more time for Q&A, but here we are.